advanced strategic bombers, and multiple leaders, including President Obama, verbally promised that the United States will come to the aid of South Korea. And the latest effort, one of the latest efforts that the United States made was the announcement of the Washington Declaration, which I briefly mentioned earlier, where President Biden agreed to establish the nuclear consultative group, where the two countries will jointly plan the use of American nuclear weapons in a North Korea contingency, and also to rotate the U.S.'s nuclear powered ballistic missile submarines to South Korea. We can talk more about these measures if you want during Q&A, but those are pretty significant. The United States is trying pretty hard. Although the U.S. stopped short of agreeing to sort of the NATO kind of nuclear sharing arrangement, President Yoon Suk-yeol really demanded tactical nuclear weapons back in South Korea, and a more sort of a more like institutionalized nuclear sharing arrangement. However, that didn't happen, but still, those are pretty significant measures. In return for that, President Yoon Suk-yeol confirmed South Korea's commitment to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But will these measures weaken South Korea's call for nuclear armament? I don't believe that they will, because there is the credibility question. As you all know, the credibility of nuclear extended deterrence has been questioned over and over again, not only by South Korea, but also by other countries as well. And when it comes to this nuclear consultative group that Biden promised, it is not really clear if Washington will actually allow South Korea to become involved in detailed military planning for the use of nuclear weapons. The United States doesn't normally do this. And even if Washington agrees to establish this concrete plan, it is unclear if Washington will follow through on that plan if push comes to shove. And more fundamentally, it is this Washington Declaration doesn't address the fundamental skepticism toward the extended deterrence, which is that it's hard to believe that Washington will sacrifice its people and the cities to save South Koreans, especially if North Korea acquires the ability to launch a nuclear attack against the United States. Now, of course, North Korea has intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach the United States, but it is unclear if North Korea has the so-called re-entry vehicle technology that protects nuclear warheads from intense heat and vibrations generated when intercontinental ballistic missiles go out of the planet and come back to Earth. So that's not clear, but some intel people argue that North Korea has already acquired that. But even if it doesn't, we believe that North Korea is inching closer toward acquiring this ability. So then, in that situation, then there is a mutual, like, assured destruction established between the United States and North Korea, and will the United States retaliate against North Korea if North Korea attacks South Korea first? So this quote is from 조선일보, South Korean conservative media newspapers editorial board, which was released right after the Washington Declaration, which said this declaration seems to put more emphasis on American concerns about South Korea's going nuclear than on North Korea's nuclear threats. And South Korea must be in a position to defend itself. So the prospect for the Washington Declaration alleviating South Koreans' concerns, I think it's not that good. Another reason why I think the South Korea's nuclear ambition will persist is because there are some other reasons why South Koreans want nuclear weapons. According to the Chicago survey, again, that I conducted with my colleagues, surprisingly, we found that 39% of people said that they want nuclear weapons because of threats other than North Korea. In another question we asked, like, which countries will be the biggest threat to South Korea in 10 years, and over 55% said China. So assuming from that, we can kind of speculate that at least partially China's increasing assertiveness is at least a partial reason behind South Korea's call for nuclear weapons. And also, Prestige was also an important factor. 26% said prestige, and only 10% picked the skepticism toward nuclear, the U.S.'s security guarantee as the reason. So, of course, this is one data point. We need more investigation into this. However, if this is correct, then Washington's efforts to alleviate South Korea will not address. Not make South Korea's call for nuclear weapons disappear. However, nonetheless, I don't really think that South Korea will acquire nuclear weapons because it is just simply too costly. First, the U.S. may withdraw its security guarantee. When President Park Chung-hee gave up his nuclear weapons program, the U.S. threatened to withdraw security guarantee, and that led Park Chung-hee to close the program. And the U.S. may the U.S. May try to do that again. Although this is debatable, we can talk about this during Q&A if you want, because I hear that increasingly more American people are becoming not supportive, but acceptive of more tolerant toward the idea of a nuclear Korea. But there is a risk that actually acquiring nuclear weapons will undermine South Korea's security if the U.S.'s security guarantee was withdrawn, especially during the period that South Korea tries to acquire workable nuclear weapons, which will take some time. Some say 3 to 5 years, and others say shorter than that. But yeah. And also, economic costs will be really high. There could be international UN Security Council level sanctions, and Chinese sanctions alone will be really destructive to South Korea's economy. It's heavily dependent on exports, and the South Korea's nuclear fuel supply will be disrupted, and also reputational costs will be high. South Korea will fall from a soft power, emerging soft power powerhouse to a nuclear international pariah. So this will be very costly, and therefore a more rational choice for South Korea would be nuclear hedging. And acquiring the ability to develop nuclear weapons in short order if it decides to do so in the future. And South Korea has a pretty significant nuclear technology. It has a sophisticated nuclear energy program that it built after renouncing its nuclear weapons program based on assistance that it received from the United States and Canada. And now South Korea has emerged as the 5th largest nuclear energy producer after the US, China, France, and Russia. And also it's a rising nuclear vendor. Recently, South Korea completed the construction of 4 nuclear power plants in the UAE, and it is competing with China, Russia, and the United States and France in the global nuclear market. However, South Korea lacks the capability to produce nuclear fissile materials through enrichment and reprocessing. It has the know-how to do that. Everybody believes that South Korea will be able to do that. However, under the bilateral nuclear cooperation agreement with the United States, so-called the 123 agreement, South Korea is prohibited from doing so. But South Korea is trying to acquire those technologies through the civilian nuclear program. South Korea has been arguing that it needs enrichment and pyroprocessing, a kind of reprocessing technologies for its civilian program, the enrichment for its fuel production, because South Korea needs enriched uranium to run its nuclear power plants, and pyroprocessing for spent fuel management. And developing these technologies is not illegal under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Some say that that is a loophole in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Others say that that was the only thing that they could agree upon. But anyways, it is not illegal as long as South Korea places international monitoring safeguards, IAEA safeguards, on those facilities. However, under the 123 agreement, South Korea needs the U.S.'s consent before doing this. So the two countries renegotiated the treaty back in 2015 after about 6 years of negotiations. And finally, Washington sort of opened the possibility of South Korea's enrichment to 20%. However, so I mean, South Korea demanded this for a long time, and the U.S. said, okay, we can talk about it more, and potentially you can do this up to 20%. But since then, that was already 8 years ago. There hasn't been much progress, and then because from the U.S.'s perspective, that rationale the South Korea uses is not very convincing, because enriched uranium, there has not been any disruption in the international supply of enriched uranium. And so why do you want to build your own enrichment capabilities? And private processing, well, that is not really going anywhere. Other countries, the UK and the US, have also tried to develop the technology, but it was just really not going anywhere. And so the rationale is pretty weak. And South Korea is taking another route to pursue enrichment now with the nuclear-powered submarine program. South Korea's argument is that North Korea has the ability to launch nuclear weapons from submarines, and South Korea also needs submarines, nuclear-powered submarines that can stay underwater for an extended period of time in order to counter North Korea's SLBM threats. And the Non-Proliferation Treaty is actually silent on the non-explosive use of nuclear technologies, even if it is for military purposes. And therefore, IAEA safeguards are not even required. And so potentially, if South Korea acquires enrichment capabilities for its naval reactor, then IAEA won't be able to monitor what South Korea does with this fissile materials from the naval reactor. And so the 123 agreement, when it comes to military use of nuclear technologies, including nuclear power submarines, the 123 agreement strictly prohibits South Korea's enrichment reprocessing. And also from the US's perspective of strategic rationale is pretty questionable, because unlike the AUKUS deal, unlike Australia, which has to roam around the vast Indian Ocean, South Korea's main adversary is right in above it's north of its country, and then the ocean. I mean, so South Korea already has pretty advanced diesel-powered submarines that can stay underwater for up to 50 days. And does South Korea need more than that? And also, when it comes to the diesel-powered submarines are actually quieter, and so they are in a way less vulnerable to detection. And nuclear power submarines are very expensive, and that's why some American policymakers think that while South Korea is pursuing this for nuclear hedging purposes, but South Korea has been seeking to revise the 123 agreement. This is an ongoing thing. But I'm not saying that this enrichment reprocessing for South Korea's civil and military programs won't be any value at all. That could be helpful. However, if they develop them, this technology would also satisfy South Korea's ambition to go nuclear quickly. And once South Korea acquires nuclear fissile materials or nuclear weapons, South Korea will be prepared to deliver them, because South Korea has very advanced dual-capable delivery mechanisms. As some scholars have pointed out, having nuclear-capable delivery mechanisms significantly shortens the nuclear weaponization process, and thus narrow the window of opportunity. So it is a good nuclear hedging measure. And I argue that actually South Korea has a nuclear triad, the potential to have nuclear triad, although it doesn't have nuclear weapons. South Korea has developed advanced short and intermediate range ballistic missiles, the ground-based, ground-launched ballistic missiles, and even the capability to develop solid-fueled intercontinental ballistic missile. The picture on the bottom right is a picture taken from South Korea's launch of space rocket last year, in December last year. And then that task actually indicates that South Korea could actually build ICBM, solid-fueled ICBM. And South Korea is the only non-nuclear weapon state that has the capability to launch nuclear weapons from underwater, from submarine. South Korea tested SLBMs a couple of times. already. And then also the picture on the picture of the fighter, that is a KKF-21 Burame 4.5 generation brand new fighter, which can carry nuclear weapons. South Korea doesn't have strategic bombers, but it is not difficult to redesign these fighters to deliver nuclear weapons. So far, I have argued that South Korea has sophisticated nuclear technologies and delivery mechanisms, and so once it acquires nuclear weapons, it will be able to develop a workable nuclear arsenal pretty quickly. And South Korea is pursuing the fissile materials in order to be able to build nuclear weapons quickly. But some argue that South Korea actually may not need nuclear weapons in order to deter North Korea's nuclear threats. And in fact, South Korea has a conventional deterrence strategy. It's three-pronged strategy, including consists of first kill chain. The kill chain is a strategy to preemptively attack North Korea's nuclear and missile sites if North Korea's attack against South Korea is imminent. It is a counter force strike. And then if South Korea cannot get rid of all the missiles and nuclear weapons of North Korea, then whatever will come from North Korea will be intercepted by, the goal is to intercept them by KAMD, Korean Aerial Missile Defense. And then after South Korea is attacked first, then South Korea will retaliate against North Korea. It's a counter-value strike against the people and the leadership, the KMPR, Korean Massive Retaliation, Punishment and Retaliation. So some argue that South Korea really has advanced conventional capabilities far superior to North Korea's conventional capabilities. And with the development of conventional technologies these days, in South Korea will be able to deter North Korea with its conventional capabilities. But I think that I argue that actually the deterrent effectiveness of this the conventional deterrence strategy is questionable. First of all, for kill chain, in order for kill chain to work, South Korea will be able to detect and strike North Korea's nuclear arsenal, which will be really hard, especially when North Korea has the ability to launch missiles from submarines, and it has and so North Korea can hide them. And then, of course, South Korea doesn't know where all North Korea's assets are to begin with, and then they are moving. And missile defense, there are a lot of skeptics of missile defense. I know that Professor Postel here at MIT is also very skeptical. But even if missile defense works, normally pretty well, still missile defense can shoot down only so many missiles, as Hamas's recent attack against Israel shows. Israel's very advanced, very impressive Iron Dome missile defense system was just overwhelmed by just the sheer number of missiles that Hamas fired at Israel. And given the fact that North Korea's missiles are so much more sophisticated than Hamas's missiles, I'm skeptical about the missile defense, the deterrence by denial strategy. And I believe that the counter value strike, especially the decapitation strategy has the highest chance of deterrence by punishment, because the North Korea's center of gravity is the leadership, and if Kim Jong-un believes that South Korea will be able to remove Kim Jong-un, strike Kim Jong-un and the North Korean elites whereabouts, then this deterrence will work. However, South Korea will never really be sure if Kim Jong-un will believe that capability. And so I argue that South Korea will not be satisfied with its conventional deterrence strategy and pursue nuclear hedging. So lastly, then what does this mean for Washington? What should Washington do if South Korea's call for nuclear armament persists, and then if South Korea continues to pursue nuclear hedging strategy? So a lot of people, when they talk about this as a policy recommendation, they say, enhance the credibility of extended deterrence. But how do you really do that? And we have to really think very serious about whether just enhancing nuclear extended deterrence will fundamentally address South Korea's sense of insecurity, and because the U.S. has been doing a lot for South Korea, and then South Korea's sense of insecurity is not really disappearing. And also, some argue that what about redeploying U.S.'s tactical nuclear weapons to South Korea? Well, I think that this is not really going to solve the problem either. I think it is actually the worst of both worlds, in the sense that South Korea will still not have access to the authority to use nuclear weapons. But those tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea will become the first target if something happens. And then also, even if the U.S. deploys nuclear weapons in South Korea, I don't really think that South Korea will be then just happen like, okay, we feel pretty good now. I don't think so. And then the question is whether Washington should support or at least condone South Korea's nuclear armament, or at least nuclear latency or nuclear hedging. We can talk more about this, and I actually want to hear your thoughts on this as well. Yeah. So I will just conclude by briefly talking about some contributions that this book project will hopefully make to the nuclear proliferation literature. This project touches upon a lot of subtopics of the nuclear studies, including nuclear export controls, extended deterrence, and etc. And I hope that this book will be a good case study for all those topics. And also it contributes to Korean studies. So when it comes to like these issues, nuclear issues in Korea, in Korean studies, most scholars focus on North Korea's nuclear threats, North Korean missiles, but not much attention has been paid to South Korea's nuclear capabilities or conventional capabilities either. And also, when we talk about South Korea's nuclear option, we normally talk about it in a binary fashion, either have them or not have them. But there is a third option, which is nuclear hedging. And South Korea's nuclear armament, or even nuclear latency, will have significant implications. Even if South Korea doesn't build nuclear weapons, of course, if South Korea builds nuclear weapons, the consequences will be even more dire, because it's almost axiomatic, that Japan will follow suit, and then the security environment in Northeast Asia will become even more volatile with Chinese protests and North Korea's protests also. But even South Korea's nuclear latency will destabilize the global. Undermine the global nuclear non-proliferation norms, because then there are some other nuclear aspirants, well, Saudi Arabia and some other countries come to my mind. They will also try to follow suit and by developing enrichment and reprocessing. Well, thank you very much for your attention.
So I'm going to give priority first questions for our staff fellows.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I have a question about the causes of the consistent public support for nuclear armament. So how much do you think?
Stand up, James, so we hear you better.
How much do you think the information of that imbalance between elites and public play a role, specifically about the potential cost of nuclear armament? And I know you told us about building independent nuclear arsenal would be very costly, which I totally agree. But I wonder how much, when you're conducting the surveys, and I know there are some research that shows if you tell them about the potential cost of nuclear armament, then that totally changes the responses of the public, South Korean public. So do you think the public knows about those potential costs and still prefers the nuclear weapons, or is it they don't have good knowledge of the cost compared to the elites, and that's the reason? And if yes, why is it the elites that intentionally preventing the public know the actual cost of nuclear armament to gain some leverage in their negotiation with Washington? I think that will also have a policy implication for Washington, because one option for Washington would be making clear statement about warning about the cost of going nuclear to South Koreans, that they will stop their, not just increasing the credibility of alliance, but also about telling the people about what they're going to do when South Korea releases those nuclear weapons. So.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you for the question. So actually, where my colleagues focus on
Just, we'll get Marty, yes, my question.
So yeah, when we actually decided to conduct this survey, our hypothesis was that actually when people learn about the cost of nuclear armament, they will change their opinion. Because we're very unsatisfied with the surveys that are out there that just ask one single question: do you support South Korea's nuclear weapons or not? And so we thought that that's not a very good way to do it. And so we actually asked the question first: do you support it or not? And then gave the follow-up questions like, do you think that the United States would withdraw the security guarantee if South Korea was nuclear? And do you think that China will impose sanctions? Do you think that North Korea will really not give up? I mean, the South Korea's nuclear will end any efforts for North Korea's denuclearization, to force denuclearize. But actually, and so we asked those questions in order to make them understand that these are the costs for nuclear. But actually, surprisingly, only 11% changed their opinion after being informed of those potential consequences. So that was a really big surprise. However, recently there was another survey conducted by Team Nuclear Institute of National Unification that actually found different results. Actually, a significant number of people changed their minds. And so the support for nuclear weapons dropped by like 30% to 30-something%, 60-something%. So that is pretty significant when we try to just reconcile this, this disconnect. And so we are going to conduct another survey and try to have another follow-up questions. Some other follow-up questions. I'm not really sure if the media intentionally withhold the kind of information about negative consequences, because when we talk about some politicians and some conservative media talk about South Korea, the need for South Korea to develop nuclear weapons, they mostly support that, but they don't necessarily talk about negative consequences. But I think that some liberals, like progressives, talk about some negative consequences, and that they're against the idea of going nuclear. But the idea of Washington kind of, publicly explaining the potential consequences, that's just not a very nice thing to do as an ally, right? And so I don't think that Washington does that, but people understand that there will be some consequences. But thank you.
Sarah, let's hear the French views.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have two questions. One is about public opinion. I have three actually. One is public opinion. You mentioned that 9% of the people supported U.S. nukes in South Korea, the deployment of U.S. nukes. You said that only 9% of South Korean people supported U.S. nukes. I thought this number was very low, and I'm interested if you have any explanation for that. I thought this as to why is it so. And the second question is that you didn't mention the possibility of the stability-instability paradox that could kick in if South Korea acquires nuclear weapon, the US pulls out, and you have North and South Korea with nuclear arms. Is it something that is considered by experts in South Korea? It's something you have an opinion on how it will play out. And I forgot my third question. I apologize, I did not know that. Write it down. If it comes back later, I will ask you.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. So only 9% supported the U.S.'s tactical nuclear weapons. Well, I don't have a strong answer to that. I mean, and then that is another question that I think that we should examine more deeply in our follow-up survey. But I mean, we were a little bit concerned about asking this question because, do people really understand what tactical nuclear weapons really are? But we still wanted to ask this question because that's what a lot of politicians are talking about. But if I have to guess, this is just my speculation, but I think that South Koreans are just, they want to have their own weapons. And so because even if the United States has nuclear weapons, well, this is based on the assumption that people understand what tactical nuclear weapons mean. But even if the U.S. deploys tactical nuclear weapons, still South Korea doesn't have the authority to use them. And if it's just still, I think that that's in the realm of extended deterrence. Just that the only difference is that nuclear weapons are closer or in Korea. So still, I think South Koreans want autonomy and their own capabilities. I haven't really heard anybody talking about the stability and instability question among experts, and so I cannot really answer it. But sorry, very good question though.
Sarah, did you want to?
No, my question also actually was sort of dovetailing on what Thomas just asked about the stability and stability paradox. So I'll be curious to hear what answer you come up with. Thank you.
Yeah.
Very positive.
So I enjoyed your talk, and I found your theoretical policy applications to be slightly orthogonal to your argument, because as far as I can tell, you basically think the argument for South Korea having its own nuclear weapons is actually quite strong. And as far as I can tell, the South Korean public also thinks the argument is quite strong. And I think almost any nuclear deterrence theorist in the abstract would say that the argument is quite strong. There are no technical obstacles in South Korea to prevent it from being a nuclear weapon state. So my question is, what is it about the South Korean establishment that makes them willing to continue this dependency relationship with the United States, which actually puts their country at risk? Right? So there's some factor X that's dispositive here that seems to me either be outside the argument or it's in another argument, but I'm having trouble sort of guessing what it is. I think I know what it is, but I wonder what you say it is.
Yeah, so your question is basically then why South Korea doesn't pursue nuclear weapons, but according to my argument.
Most of your talk made a strong argument for why they should. The reasons you advanced for why they shouldn't are weak, with one exception, and it's the relationship with the U.S.
Yeah, and because the costs are just really high, because the costs would be too high.
No, they wouldn't. The cost is the relationship with the U.S. Is that cost higher than being dependent on the U.S. at the risk of the North, or is it not?
So I don't think that the relationship with the United States is the only reason. I think that economic factor is also very big reason, because South Koreans say that they support nuclear weapons, but if we start talking about like really tangible economic consequences, I don't really think that they will support nuclear armament.
What are the economic consequences? You think it's really possible to sustain a global sanctions regime against South Korea over nuclear weapons choices? It's not possible.
Well, so yeah.
Nuclear weapons are basically cheap. I don't see what the cost structure is.
Well, I think that when the United States deployed the THAAD missile defense system on South Korean soil back in 2016 and 17, China imposed sanctions against South Korean businesses and the tourism industry. That led to a decrease in South Korea's GDP by 0.4%. I mean, that was in comparison to South Korea's nuclear armament, that is such a much benign situation for China. But so China's sanctions alone would be very costly, but also international sanctions. I'm not really sure if there will be no economic sanctions on the part of the international community if South Korea suddenly builds nuclear weapons.
You're not convincing me. I'm
Well,
not convinced that these costs drive the decision of the South Korean establishment. It seems to me that your argument will be stronger if you actually try to weigh the main consequence against the main benefit. The main consequence is tense relations with the United States. That's the main consequence.
I think part of the argument here, can you give us some examples of where the South Korea establishment has really gone against the United States? Or is the South Korea establishment simply this wants to be in lockstep with the United States and nuclear issues are first and foremost among those?
So if there have been any cases where South Korean establishments went against the United States, especially the liberals and progressives in South Korea do not really. They tend to be more sort of nationalistic, and then like they want to have more autonomy. And so there have been some cases in, for example, like some like free trade agreement. There have been some conflicts between the two countries, and but South Korea relies on the U.S. for security guarantee today, right? Well, if South Korea had nuclear latency, which it doesn't, but it's trying to have that, then going nuclear will be really, really quickly. I mean, South Korea can go nuclear really quickly. In that situation, I think South Korea may be able to withstand this, sanctions, potential sanctions, and damage to the U.S.-South Korea alliance. However, so that is a Japan case, right? Japan can build nuclear weapons overnight because it can, it has nuclear fissile materials, but so that's what South Korea wants, in my opinion. However, if South Korea tries to build nuclear weapons today, then I asked Matthew Ban, Dr. Matthew Ban at the Belfer Center, because he knows the technical stuff. How long it will take South Korea to build nuclear weapons to start today. And then he says 3 to 5 years. Why? Because South Korea doesn't have the capability or facilities to build nuclear fissile materials. That takes time. And so, if it is a Japan kind of situation where South Korea can just hang tight for like 3 months, 6 months, maybe South Korea will be able to do that. But if South Korea will have to, withstand this pressure and sanctions and everything for 3 to 5 years, that will be too costly. So my argument is South Korea wants to get to the point where it can build nuclear weapons and then it can, narrow the window of vulnerability so that it can just present that option as a fait accompli. So, okay, we have them. What do you want to do? What are you going to do?
Okay, well, responding to that, first of all, South Korea has a very large reactor program, and it can implement its reprocessing program, which Matthew Bunn was talking about, under the guise of reprocessing fuel for use in their reactors. It's not really economically a viable option, but it's close. So they can do that, and they can avoid sanctions until they get to the end of the cycle. So we're not talking 3 to 5 years. We're talking less than 1 year. Then the 20% restriction on their enrichment is no problem at all anymore. That's enough for all their reactors, and they don't need high enriched uranium for nuclear warheads. They can rely on plutonium. So the combination of those two means they can have a short window of vulnerability.
So South Korea doesn't have reprocessing capability. I mean, Japan does. South Korea doesn't.
That's right. It would take them 3 to 5 years to build it, and they would build it under the guise of this civilian nuclear
But that's not
program.
allowed under the 123 agreement. And so under the 123 agreement, so you mentioned the 20% enrichment. So what the revised agreement said is that South Korea can enrich uranium up to 20% with the U.S.'s consent, but still South Korea needs to get the U.S.'s consent, and the United States is not giving South Korea the consent. And so just really, so they have been. So that's my argument. South Korea is trying to convince the United States, persuade the United States to give that consent to South Korea in order to have the latent capability, but it's not possible today.
Do you think if they broke some of those rules, it would trigger international sanctions under the guise of a nuclear power program?
Well, at that point, so that will be questionable. Theoretically, very legally speaking, this 123 agreement says that South Korea cannot enrich or reprocess U.S. origin materials. And so theoretically, if South Korea gets enrichment from uranium from another country and enrich it in South Korea, that's not going to be a violation of this 123 agreement. However, that's going to be a very big, that's going to cause big damage to the alliance and the South Korea's relationship with the United States, and so that's almost like a nuclear weapon option. And so, yeah, South Korea has been refraining from doing that.
Chicago.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your talk very much. I'm Chicago, I'm a visiting scholar here for the year. I'm usually more on other years. I'm a professor at Waseda University in Tokyo. So Japan has the similar problem, which is the unsure whether U.S. will actually extend the umbrella. So this has been the case, and Japan has kept its what you call latent nuclear capability. But it's not building anything, although independently the technologies are advancing, but there's no concerted effort to actually build them all. So I think the biggest concern that probably South Korea and Japan have is about US, right? But it's not just the US, it's the North Korean capability, but more importantly, probably Chinese capabilities. And so the big question is, can they be deterred? Can North Korea and China be deterred from using nuclear weapons against South Korea and against Japan? So you have several moving parts. And one of my students did a study on Japan's nuclear latency, and the findings was that it was more to negotiate with US, less about deterring. And if you think, because US has been, basically saying that we're going to defend no matter what kind of assurance. And if that verbal assurance plus the 5,000 nuclear warhead is not going to deter North Korea or China, it's a little bit Pollyannish to think that few nuclear weapons of your own would actually do the job, right? So it's really about, how trying to, maybe it's more to do with trying to negotiate with US, even in South Korean case. And one of the things that you didn't touch upon is the wartime command. Would these things actually reassure South Korea more? And the big question is, if South Korea wanted to develop nuclear weapons, is it really not in US interest to let South Korea do that? If it's within the alliance, is that so bad? And I agree with Barry's argument. I think tourists not coming to South Korea would be a really, really small issue compared with the situation where you have very little credibility in the alliance as a whole. If you cannot, think about nuclear deterrence, how are you going to be so sure about conventional deterrence as well? So I think the economic cost argument is extremely weak. Not today, but in a situation where South Korea actually does decide and wants to go nuclear.
Okay, yeah, there were several questions. So, just regarding the first point that you made, yeah, you said like if U.S.'s alliance with the United States and thousands of U.S. Nuclear weapons cannot deter North Korea from attacking South Korea, or Japan, will South Korea's and Japan's like a few nuclear weapons will be able to deter North Korea or China? So someone would argue that they will be happy to have their own nuclear weapons, even if it's just a handful, than relying on other countries' nuclear weapons. That depends. That depends on the faith that you have in the extended deterrence and your allies' security guarantee. I mean, this question has been addressed just pretty much since the development of nuclear weapons, and different people have different thoughts on this. But ultimately, security establishment would never really be 100% sure that they can rely on another country, because the president of the United States, his or her main responsibility is to protect his or her own people, and so it's questionable, but defense people, they want to have more certainty about their ability to defend themselves, and so that depends on how you view the credibility of extended deterrence. Another question about international sanctions and proposal, you also mentioned that. Now, I want to ask you the question. I mean, this is also, about projection. Will the international community and the United States and China be okay with South Korea's nuclear weapons development? I mean, yeah, of course, everybody understands that South Korea is facing a nuclear threat, but if letting South Korea have nuclear weapons without any consequences, that's going to affect the global nuclear proliferation norms, quite significantly. And so, if you have thoughts, I would be really happy to hear your
It
thoughts.
seems like the United States is hell-bent on a containment policy in Asia. So in the midst of a containment policy in Asia, we're going to have a feud with one of our principal allies that says it needs nuclear weapons the same way the French have nuclear weapons, or the Indians have nuclear weapons, or the Russians have nuclear weapons. I think we would definitely try and stop it because we have our own view of these things. And our view is that if we're going to defend a country, then we're going to manage the nuclear crises from Washington. We're not going to have two decision centers managing a nuclear crisis. I think that's always been the basic American bias, right? I don't think if North Korea, a liberal democratic capitalist country within its own political system, makes a decision to withdraw from the nuclear non-proliferation treaty and get nuclear weapons, the United States is going to go to economic war with South Korea? I don't think it is. Now, it might reconsider the alliance, right? It might reconsider the alliance, but look at the other nuclear powers, independent nuclear powers with which we have alliances. So what would actually be the liberal argument? Right? What would be the liberal coalitional argument as to why a liberal democratic member of our coalition can't have its own autonomous nuclear weapons capability? For that matter, Israel has its own nuclear weapons capability. Right? Now, I can see why South Korean politicians wouldn't want to go through all this Sturm und Drang. I think if you explore it, the answers you give are not so cut and dry, right? You provide answers that are kind of cut and dry. You wouldn't do this because of that cause. You wouldn't do this because of that cause. Well, a lot of those costs don't really seem that important to me relative to the national security problem that the North faces, which you outline extremely well. Right? That they have a nuclear adversary to the north who's getting better, a nuclear adversary that can reach out to the United States to make our commitment much costlier than it was, right? And if truth be told, China is some sort of a problem in its own right. So South Korea lives in a tough neighborhood, right? And their conventional spending shows that they understand they live in a tough neighborhood, right? This argument shows that they know they live in a tough neighborhood. The latency they're trying to get shows that they know they live in a tough neighborhood, and they're willing to do all kinds of things and pay all kinds of costs to do it. But they won't pay the biggest cost, which is the political process of making this happen and the effects of that political process on the alliance with the United States. They just don't want to find out what it's like. It's my suspicion. I don't know. I'd love to see what their polling shows. Experiments with people in the South Korean establishment, but the way you lay out the case, it seems to me the facts of the case point ineluctably to a very strong South Korean motivation to have an independent nuclear deterrent, and they have all the capabilities for doing so, right? So if they don't do it, what's the reason? I don't think if you want to array the cost, I think you want to be pretty serious about assessing those costs. Really pick away at them and say, well, these are the costs that a non-proliferation person would make or somebody else would make. But let's rank these costs and try and zero in on what the main perceived cost is that the South Korean establishment wrestles with every time they come up with this program. That's I think would strengthen your presentation a lot. That's why you asked me I don't usually do this, but you asked me my opinion, so I can.
Yeah, I appreciate it very much. This project is still at the early stage, and so and I will go to Korea and do more research and perhaps experiment or another survey. But I appreciate it very much. However, really, when Israel, France, and some other countries, or India, developed nuclear weapons, that was a different time. That was before the nuclear suppliers grew, before, the sort of the global nuclear weapons, nuclear non-proliferation norms became really mature. And uh, of course, now South Korea faces a bigger threat. And but yeah, this is a question that I've, so in the past, like several years ago, I thought that, okay, these costs were really just very clear. I mean, I didn't have any doubts. But I do also think that here, that increasingly more American people say that, well, we should, South Korea's going nuclear is an inevitability. We may have to live with it. However, well, if I talk to government people, government officials, and policymakers, of course, they may have to say that a nuclear South Korea is just not acceptable, but they are very clear on this issue. And so, yeah, I will look into that. But thank you very much.
Just very briefly to that, I think it will be interesting to see whether the going nuclear is coupled with annulment or accepting the withdrawal of the U.S. or annulment of the alliance. Whether they're two, maybe it could be very optimistically hoping that South Korea would get its own nuclear weapons, but still somehow get to keep the alliance, because those are extremely different things. Right? So it's the real cost is not to have the alliance. So it will be interesting to see whether people or the establishment actually think of it as we need the nuclear weapons, even if we lose the alliance.
Yeah. But again, it will take South Korea some time to build a workable nuclear arsenal without enrichment reprocessing. And so, during that period, South Korea will not have, I mean, we'll have to see. But if South Korea loses an alliance without having nuclear weapons yet, that is the critical vulnerability that South Korea has to seriously worry about. And yeah.
I had Eric and Charlie. Do one of you have a question that really picks up on this thread, or a new direction you want to go?
Yeah, I had a comment.
Okay, go ahead.
Because you asked about the economic cost. Just to add to what Barry said, on the Chinese side, I would be hesitant to offer sort of a definitive prediction, but nevertheless, we have several cases of Chinese use of economic statecraft, and all of them avoid, taking measures that will badly damage China's own industrial potential. So, in the Australia case, in the THAAD case, tourism, shopping centers, some commercial trade, farm goods, but not anything that involves investment, critical materials, other things. And so I haven't seen any indication that China would be willing to do that. And I think they're less willing to do it now and going forward than they would have been 5 years ago. So growth now is at 5%, headed for 3%, and everybody's pulling out, not going in. So there's one thing. And then I just had a question, which is, I'm actually a little bit unsure on what your policy preference here is. So if it is latency, it sounded a lot like latency at a minimum was a step towards getting a nuclear weapon. If you wanted a nuclear weapon, is that what you're looking at?
Yeah, so I am thinking more about this because I think, we have to think about different scenarios in order to assess which option would be the best. So if the alternative of nuclear hedging is nuclear armament, then I think that acquiring nuclear latency is better. Because if South Korea doesn't have nuclear latency, then it will just just acquire nuclear weapons. Then I think nuclear latency is better. I think actually trying to get nuclear weapons now is very risky because if North Korea would ever want to attack South Korea, then it will be when North Korea believes that South Korea will acquire nuclear weapons soon. So during this, period, and that will be the point when North Korea will try to attack South Korea. So I think for that reason also it is dangerous to go nuclear at this point. And so I am thinking more about this, and so in a way, I'm wondering if the United States should at least allow South Korea to acquire nuclear latency if that will make South Korea feel better. But then the danger is that South Korea can build nuclear weapons quickly afterwards. And so, Yeah, but that's still better than South Korea acquiring nuclear weapons because the consequences will be very severe for the security in the region and in the globe. And so I'm struggling with this question myself now.
Charles Glazer.
Just a couple comments on your argument, but then slightly different question. I agree on the cost exaggeration. So if you look at the India-Pakistan weaponization, there were sanctions, but they weren't very costly, and now India's been brought fully into the sort of revised regime, and I think the United States would be at least as understanding of South Korean proliferation. So I don't see the economic cost being large there. I was thinking they would be maybe large from the China side, but Eric says they wouldn't be. So, but I think the sanctions would be not extremely costly. I mean, and they might be, you never know, but the India example suggests otherwise. The India-Pakistan example suggests otherwise. I also think the NPT norm, its impact is greatly exaggerated. So there hasn't been a cascade generated by each step of proliferation has not generated a huge cascade. Countries are mostly deciding if they need nuclear weapons, and if they really need them for whatever reason, right or wrong, they've proceeded to get them. And there's just very few potentially marked cases at the margin. So anyway, so the norm isn't that strong. It's there, it's costly, but states have incurred those costs. I don't think it would be huge to the regime. So I think those are you just do want to be careful with them. So I agree with you, and I guess it probably would be the potential risk with respect to the United States. And I think it would create huge havoc. But in the end, the United States wants South Korea as an ally. And I think it would keep it as an ally, nuclear or not. So there'd be, some risk, and it would be a very challenging period. There'd be a lot of anger and unhappiness because we've stopped many allies from getting nuclear weapons. We care about it. We've coerced our allies pretty severely, including Germany, Taiwan, South Korea, when they were pursuing weapons. But nevertheless, I think that it would work out. So it makes me wonder if, maybe the South Koreans are misjudging that, or maybe they're not as worried about extended deterrence as they say. But that would be I think that's the way to square the circle. One way or the other, those would be one of the two options for why South Korea isn't proceeding. So I just put, I think those are in line sort of with what some other people have said, but I think it's, on the other hand, you are rolling the dice. If I were South Korea, I would rather have the United States as an ally than have nuclear weapons without the United States. So if you think that's a possibility, then you should be very cautious. My question is actually about the deterrent value of a latent program. A lot of wars start pretty quickly. So I'm just wondering, what wars are what are the scenarios that you envision, since you're a latency proponent, that latency would be adequate to deter? Let's say it's a 6-month window, which I think is a pretty quick conversion from not having fissile material to having a weapon. It won't happen that fast. But let's say it was 6 months. What wars wouldn't be resolved within 6 months and therefore would be deterred by the possibility?
Yeah, to answer your question, for instance, I know that there are some papers that are out there that argue that nuclear latency itself has deterrent effect. I don't think so. The reason that you just stated, but unless you have nuclear weapons, nuclear latency itself is not going to deter an enemy from attacking you. However, it will just shorten the amount of time that you need if something happens. If you get really nervous about a potential conflict, and you can build nuclear weapons quickly. So that is the value, but it doesn't have the deterrent value, in my opinion. But regarding sanctions and regarding some other causes, I could really appreciate your comments. But India and Pakistan didn't join the NPT. They didn't violate the non-proliferation treaty to develop nuclear weapons.
But South Korea can legally get out relatively quickly.
Yeah, that is true. However, North Korea was the only country that joined and left the treaty, but that's North Korea. But if South Korea does that, and South Korea claims, and other countries also accept South Korea as a, norm-abiding, good, member of the international community. And so I think if South Korea does that, the damage to the non-proliferation norm will be very significant. And also, it is true that India and Pakistan now, especially, India, but also Pakistan, are sort of accepted as nuclear weapon states, not officially under the non-proliferation treaty, but still the sanctions are mostly, withdrawn. And then also because of strategic importance of those countries. And I agree with that. However, Pakistan had to go through economic sanctions, for a while. And I don't think that South Korea will be willing to, face that kind of international sanctions for that long period of time. I mean, Pakistanis said that we will build nuclear weapons even if we have to eat grass. I don't think that South Koreans would say that. And then also South Koreans, if you talk to South Koreans, well, they are sort of inured to North Korean nuclear threats. I'm not saying that they don't feel concerned about nuclear threats. However, it happens just kind of gradually, and then things are just normal, and people don't really think about North Korea's nuclear weapons on a day-to-day basis. And so, when it comes to cost-benefit analysis, and then in terms of the cost of nuclear. But I'm not sad on this. I'm going to delve into this, and I am also thinking about this. But I think at this point, what I think is that the costs are really high when the cost of nuclear weapons, but the benefits are potentially huge. But a lot of people think that still it's very unlikely that North Korea will attack South Korea because. Of course, there's a threat and people are concerned about it, and the security establishment want to have the ability to defend itself. However, because of North Korea's inferior conventional capabilities, and because of a small country, if North Korea attacks South Korea in order with nuclear weapons in order to unify the country, that's just not going to happen. This is going to be radiologically contaminated. What are you going to do with this territory that is radiologically contaminated? And so still people think that the chance is pretty low. So, yeah.
Jonathan Caberly.
Well, I was just going to say, so if you want to make that argument, then you're actually making the argument that they don't need nuclear weapons very much, which is fine, but it's a little bit different than the way that you presented it. So if you want to, so if the need is smaller for those reasons, then maybe hedging looks relatively better and getting nuclear weapons looks relatively worse. But that's not this. I think it's a different spin. So I don't mean to say you have to try and have it both ways, but to reach that bottom, it would be good to decide which of those two present, views of the need you think is right.
Yeah. So I think it's not like sort of on a spectrum, right? Of course, South Korea, there is a demand for nuclear weapons, but then how much cost are you going to really be willing to bear, right? And so that's where the demand, how strong the demand is, and I think it is strong enough to pursue nuclear hedging for now, but not enough to develop nuclear weapons right now because of the cost-benefit balance. But yeah, but that's a very good point. Thank you.
So on Barry's point, at least in the short term, why Korean elites are so attached to the United States, I think there's a military reason as well as an economic reason, and probably a stronger one. I just don't think right now the Korean leadership and
Eric, and you can disabuse me of this, are particularly comfortable fighting a war or trying to deter a war without significant American conventional capabilities that exist right now. Now, South Korea is trying to build its own capabilities, almost much more so than its nuclear latency. And maybe one day it'll assess that the United States is now deterred from intervening conventionally by North Korean nuclear capability. But until that time, that is a cost that has to be factored in, whether this capability will be available to them during conflict. Whether Eric's right or not about Chinese reactions, it's certainly something that has to go into the project, right? You have to talk about what China's reaction. This is like one of the few things that China and the United States might actually agree on, at least for the next few years, right? And then the question I had for you is the fact that Japan will get there first because it already has nuclear latency in terms of developing nuclear capability. Is that something that is factored into South Korean calculus?
Yeah, so definitely, especially when it comes to Japan, South Koreans are very sensitive that Japan has the same capability, but South Korea doesn't, and also the United States sort of allowed Japan to keep this technology, whereas South Korea is not allowed to develop this technology. And so yeah, that's definitely a factor. And also, I mean, South Korea, surprisingly, South Korea considers Japan as a military threat still. I was pretty shocked to hear recently that a South Korean military officer saying that, when I was asking, like, South Korea's intermediate range missiles that go beyond the Korean Peninsula, that's potentially aimed at countering China's threats, and then actually that person, I don't know if he's right or wrong, but that person said it's more to to counter Japan's threats. And so that was pretty shocking to me. But yeah, so I think Japan is definitely a factor.
You want to, Barry, go ahead.
Piggybacking on Charlie, is it possible that latency per se doesn't contribute that much to a deterrence problem, but the deeper source of latency is concern about the American future and the future of the American commitment? So the more you doubted the future reliability of the Americans, the more latency you would want. The narrower the window between a decision and acquisition you would want. So if that's the hypothesis, you'd be looking for changes in the perceived reliability of the American commitment. And you might say that, the election of Donald Trump was Exhibit A, the kind of change going on within the Republican foreign policy establishment concomitant to that is maybe Exhibit B, right? So that there are some things in the wind that might make a country doubtful about the future of the American commitment. If that country faced a nuclear adversary, I think you'd be buying all the insurance you could get within the constraints of not killing off the relationship before it dies naturally with the United States. So what about that idea?
Yeah, so especially the doubts about American extended security guarantee enhances the desire for nuclear
Might
latency.
be fine now, but it's the future that you're insuring yourself.
Yeah, that's
Against the future, against trends, against straws in the wind. It is, after all, your national security. So all national security planning is about low probability, high cost events. And one low probability or high cost event might be U.S. exit. And if that probability is changing just a little bit, that might be perceived as a significant problem. And you have good reason in the last 10 or 15 years to start wondering whether the Americans are going to be around forever.
Yeah, and that doesn't just apply to the extended nuclear deterrence, but to the alliance as a whole. So when we talked a lot about the potential impact of Korea's going nuclear on the alliance, but we haven't really talked at all about the other conditions. So, I mean, what about North Korea's going nuclear and then getting more and more and more better nuclear in terms of that impact already, that certain independent impact, among other things, not to mention our own political maladies, but
Ken
the
has
impact of that on the future of the alliance.
Ken has a two-finger, and then we'll go to Polina Bellikova after that. Ken, do you want?
It's really building on various remarks, but thinking about Japan for a second, on latency. I had the great honor and privilege of getting drunk with a bunch of high-level Japanese members of the foreign policy elite during one of the many periods of Trump crisis and North Korean crisis. And in the midst of the evening, there was quite specific discussion of the benefits of latency in exactly the terms that you're describing it, with debates over whether you harvest materials unaccounted for from your processing facilities and do it as quietly as possible to move to a screwdriver turn away, or whether you do it in ways that are more public in order to signal what is going on. But the points that you're making are very well taken. The potential for latency as an approach within Korea, within Japan, and other countries somewhat similarly situated is a very real possibility. Now, the presence of alcohol is not an accepted procedure with MIT Human Subjects Committees, and I'm not reporting this as research. I don't know how reliable the information I obtained was, but I do want to say that I thought people were quite serious in that discussion.
Polina, yeah, can you stand up so we can see you?
Yeah, sure. Just following up on that, I think IRB does not mind if you are drunk during expert interviews. So if they're not human subjects, you can do that.
Good.
So my perception of the entire security architecture that you described to us is that it depends on timely and accurate threat assessment. And so with the strategic utility of latency will depend on what kind of war we're fighting or expecting. So I'm very curious about the politics of threat assessment in South Korea. Specifically, my understanding is that South Korea relies a lot on signal intelligence. So what are the agencies and actors that are in charge of interpreting these signals? Is there any redundancy in their responsibilities? And is there any competition between them? And of course, whether it creates the windows for failure.
Yeah. Well, the signal interpretations, of course, South Korea has many different intelligence agencies like the United States, and they don't communicate with one another. And I'm sure there's a lot of competition going on. But I haven't found anything that is in the unclassified setting about South Korea's signal interpretations capabilities, really. So, yeah, sorry about that.
You know, the reason why I'm asking is that after a recent Israeli intelligence failure, we have to take these issues very seriously, and we're talking nuclear weapons here. So that's the only reason why I'm asking this question in the context of this.
Yeah. That's I will look into that, but I doubt that I will find anything unclassified. But yeah.
I'm going to use my privilege to ask the last question, and some of us can ask more questions at lunch. But I was talking last night at our nuclear age dinner with one of our graduate students, Nicholas Planchette, who's saying that the psychological cultural meaning of nuclear weapons is much different between the French and the British. And I noticed in one of your slides you said that 26% of South Koreans said it would increase the prestige of South Korea to have nuclear weapons. And I'm also, one of the things, we have this idea about soft power and hard power, and I think you mentioned the soft power. At SSP, we're real hard power people. We like to talk about deterrence by denial and punishment and all these kinds of things. But, up the road, Harvard, they like to talk about soft power. But South Korea, as far as like soft power, they're punch way above their weight. I mean, they win Academy Awards, they have K-pop, and isn't that enough prestige as soft power? Do you need the hard power too? Or you might think we're so powerfully now in soft power that we should have hard power to match our soft power. But can you say something about the psychological meaning of like, hey, we're not dominated by Japan anymore. We don't have to be intimidated. So we should have nuclear weapons. That's a sign of our status as a country. Is that part of what's going on here or not?
So yeah, my colleagues and I also found it really surprising when we saw like 26%, want nuclear weapons because of precision. And what does prestige mean to them? I am very curious about that myself. And so because, when the French developed nuclear weapons, that getting nuclear weapons is a sign of symbol of power and all that. But I mean, recently, the nuclear aspirants like North Korea and Iran, they were just international pariahs. And so I am thinking about looking more into this. But my guess is that, South Koreans feel that they are sandwiched between the two superpowers once again, this time the United States and China, and it's just being punched around. And so I think maybe the prestige to them means like autonomy. But I'm going to interview some people and try to figure out what they really mean by prestige.
All right, so we're out of time. So let's thank our speaker.
Thank you.